Lift your shirt. If you're a resident, you shouldn't mind proving it.
That's what Maris Thorne, vice president of the High Brace Summit HOA, said to my 16-year-old daughter as she cornered her by the mailbox pavilion with a clipboard in one hand and a laminated printout in the other. Isolde had just finished tennis practice. She was wearing my old Ridgeview hoodie, zipped to the neck, and now, standing damp and alone in the shade of the cedar beams, she was being ordered to partially undress in public to verify residency compliance. There should be a badge on your upper chest, Maris continued with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Non-residents who loiter can be flagged for removal. I'm just following procedure. I dropped the grocery bag as I stepped into the scene. The milk exploded on the bricks behind me, but I didn't even look down. That badge system? I said calmly. It was never ratified, and the firmware your vendor's using still pings back to my diagnostic server. Her face twitched. I'd be careful, I added. That means every biometric scan you've logged today, every single one, was stored off-site, illegally. She didn't smile after that. If you've ever watched someone try to reduce your child to a barcode or a data point, if you've ever seen a rule used to humiliate someone just because they were alone and someone in power decided they could, then subscribe now. Because what happened here didn't just stop at a badge check. It blew open something far worse. My name is Calder Wynn. I spent over a decade as a data risk auditor for the Department of Homeland Security, specializing in biometric chain of custody cases and federal infrastructure audits. I've shut down airport terminals over firmware tampering. I've voided vendor contracts mid-flight over non-compliant facial recognition code. What I hadn't done, until that day, was turn those skills against my own neighborhood. After my wife died 5 years ago, Isolde and I moved to High Brace Summit for its gated, quiet, high-elevation air, and the digital safeguards built into every streetlight and shuttle. I believed we were buying into privacy, not control. But when I walked up to the mailbox pavilion that afternoon and saw my daughter shrinking into herself, while a clipboard and camera were aimed at her chest, I saw something I'd sworn I'd never allow on American soil again. That pavilion meant something to us. It was my wife's favorite place in the neighborhood, the one she helped design before she passed. She said it reminded her of the old countryside mail kiosks from her childhood, something human amidst the machines. Now it was a checkpoint. Maris tapped the clipboard. Non-compliance will result in temporary access suspension. Gym, pool, clubhouse, shuttle tokens. I don't make the rules, Mr. Wynn. You do when you fabricate them, I replied. I turned and filmed the signage she'd taped to the beam beside her. All residents must visibly display compliance, badges when on community property. There were no legal references, no policy numbers, no HOA board vote had ever passed such a motion. You're overstepping, Maris, I said, and what's worse, you're doing it on camera. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. The boy standing behind her, a board member's son with a smartphone, shifted uncomfortably. The phone dipped a few degrees lower. And Isolde? She just stood there, silent. Arms crossed over her chest like it was her fault someone tried to strip her of dignity in the name of safety. That's the moment I decided this wouldn't end with a warning letter. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't throw punches, but I did send 3 packets through an encrypted tunnel to a compliance server in DC. Packets with metadata that Maris's vendor never knew were being mirrored. That's how this started, not with a lawsuit, not with a protest, with a clipboard, a power-hungry HOA official, and a father who used to audit governments. I expected a quiet apology, maybe a formal retraction, buried inside the HOA newsletter in size 8 font. What I got was a notice taped to my door by sunrise. Immediate access suspension, Unit 37C. It was printed on the same white laminate Maris used for her badge signs. My daughter's name was listed in bold underneath. Isolde Wynn, flagged non-compliant, no hearing, no review, just a suspension of all access privileges, community shuttle, pool, clubhouse, gym, even the front pedestrian gate. The ink wasn't even dry before I heard whispers at the corner park. 2 other parents had received similar warnings. Both had teenage daughters. Both had refused Maris's badge display protocol the week prior. One girl, according to her mother, had been told to lift the hem of her shirt or go home. This wasn't an isolated abuse. It was a pattern. I walked into the HOA office just before noon. It's a converted home near the north gate, retrofitted with reinforced glass and a fingerprint scanner for board entry. I buzzed in and waited. The receptionist was gone, the front desk empty, but I wasn't here for conversation. I walked past the notice board and into the hallway where the compliance reports were stored. Right outside the compliance room, I paused. Framed on the wall was a photo of Maris Thorne receiving a Community Innovation Award from the County Housing Authority. Smart Security Initiatives for Gated Communities, the plaque beneath it read. I took a picture of it and kept walking. Inside the conference room, 3 people were seated. Maris at the center, her hair pinned perfectly, eyes cool and flat. Flanking her were Jared Brown, the president, and Lisette Grainer, the new treasurer. They didn't look surprised to see me. "We're in session," Jared said. "So am I answered. Maris folded her hands. "We acted within our charter. Your daughter refused a standard ID check in a communal area. That constitutes non-compliance. Under the 2023 policy addendum, that's grounds for temporary suspension. There was no vote on that addendum, no sign-off, no record of distribution. The board can authorize procedural adjustments in emergency scenarios. Our vendor flagged several unknowns in the facial scan logs this past quarter." "You mean teenagers wearing hoodies?" "Unverified individuals," she corrected. "And we aren't required to verify age if the behavior pattern fits a high-risk profile." I stared at her. "High risk?" "Loitering, avoiding identification, refusal to display issued credentials. It's not personal." I turned to Lisette. She didn't meet my eyes. Jared started to speak, but I raised a hand. "I served 14 years watching vendors like yours get subpoenaed for harvesting biometric data from minors. You're operating an unapproved scan system on teenagers. You're assigning public shame penalties without board vote. And you're about to learn how traceable those systems really are." "That's a threat," Maris said, tone sharp now. "No," I said. "It's a record." I walked out without another word. By the time I reached the pavilion, the new policy reminder signs were already up. 5 laminated notices in full color. One of them featured a red silhouette of a person with the words "non-compliant" stamped diagonally across the chest. They were plastering them across the entire neighborhood. As I passed the tennis courts, I saw 2 boys mock lifting their shirts at each other, laughing and yelling, "Compliance check," like it was a joke. Isolde wasn't there. She hadn't left her room since last night. That evening, I stood on my back patio and rewatched the footage, not just of the pavilion scene, but of every camera ping over the last 3 weeks. The firmware logs showed unusual outbound traffic every Tuesday and Friday, exactly 43 minutes after sunset. I tracked the IP to a subcontracted vendor listed in our HOA records, Centrygate Dynamics, out of Alexandria, Virginia, and listed beneath the contract summary, a line that stopped me cold. Program reference, SCA-P7. Federal Smart Community Oversight Pilot, RSTARS-NAGE, DIHS, Phase 1 trial. They weren't just testing compliance here. They were funneling data into a federal trial without consent. And Maris Thorne had just used that trial to publicly humiliate my daughter. They thought the badge was the proof, but they forgot one thing. I built the servers their system reports to. The first time I saw Elias Vellin hesitate was at the community gym, standing in front of the smoothie bar like he'd forgotten why he came. He was wearing his old Highbray Committee windbreaker, the one they gave all board members during the HOA's Wellness and Tech Integration launch last spring. He tapped his card on the scanner 3 times before it worked. When it finally beeped green, he flinched like it had shocked him. I didn't speak to him at first. I was there for the security footage. My gym access had been reinstated without explanation, likely a shallow attempt to defuse pressure after the confrontation in the office. I didn't need the treadmill, I needed timestamps. Elias spotted me near the lockers. He didn't come over, just nodded once, the way someone does when they're trying to look like nothing's wrong. But he lingered, checked his phone, scanned the perimeter. Finally, he walked up behind me as I reviewed a frame from 2 nights ago. Maris, after hours, inside the clubhouse server room. The door was supposed to require dual authentication. She was alone. "I never approved that," Elias said, voice low. "None of us did." I didn't turn around. "You mean the server install?" He exhaled slowly. "The badge policy, the pilot contract, the vendor shift. All of it. Now I turned. His eyes were bloodshot, like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. She pushed it through under a maintenance resolution, he went on. Said it was just an infrastructure update. Next thing we know, she's printing IDs, logging scan audits, locking out people who question her. And you're still signing off on her reports? I asked. His jaw tightened. You don't understand what it's like in those meetings. Jared just nods along. Lisette's new. She doesn't even know where the charter files are stored yet. And Maris, she scares you. He didn't respond. I closed the laptop and faced him fully. My daughter was just used as a test subject in a federal pilot program she didn't consent to. If you have something to share, Elias, now is the time. He swallowed hard. I can't give you documents, not without triggering a review, but I can tell you where to look. I don't want rumors. I want proof. He shook his head. You won't find it on paper, but there's a trail. During the vendor approval, she used an old vote log, one from the landscaping initiative last year, overlaid the signatures, changed the dates. I saw the files open on her laptop during a budget review. She doesn't know I noticed. Did you take a copy? He glanced around the gym, lowered his voice. I took screenshots, not enough to convict, but enough to confirm it wasn't a clerical error. My hands curled at my sides. Why not go to the board? He laughed bitterly. You think they'd believe me over her? You think they'd risk a full vote recall when half of them bought their homes based on her compliance scores? Then help me make them believe, quietly. He hesitated again, but this time, only for a second. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive, thumb worn from nervous fidgeting. This has my screenshots, he said. Board calendar mismatches, a few internal messages she sent from her private address before the last contractor vote. It's not clean, but it's a start. I took it. You just made yourself a target. No, he said, stepping back. You did. I'm just the guy handing you the keys to the front gate. He left without another word. That night, I reviewed the files on a secure drive, logged from a sandboxed environment with no external access. The screenshots were time-stamped and legitimate. One showed a calendar invite to a board session labeled Vendor Finalization, ESCOP 7, scheduled exactly 1 week before the landscaping vote she claimed authorized it. Another had a Slack export between Maris and the vendor, with her stating, I'll get the others to sign off post-activation. They'll follow when the results are clean. They weren't just piloting unauthorized tech. They were laundering compliance through silence. And Elias, tired, guilty Elias, had finally broken it. The suspension notice was just the beginning. 2 days after Elias handed me the flash drive, every entrance gate in Highsray Summit was updated with a new banner. Compliance scan in effect. Failure to display. May result in temporary lockout. They weren't just testing boundaries anymore. They were daring us to fight back. That same morning, my neighbor Geneva, Unit 35B, called in tears. Her 15-year-old son, Luca, had been denied entry by the East Pedestrian Gate. The scanner claimed his credentials were incomplete. A security drone had followed him halfway down Aspen Ridge before he ran home. Geneva wasn't political. She never attended board meetings, never complained, but her voice cracked when she said, They made him feel like a criminal, Calder, my kid, for forgetting a badge he never got. By noon, 3 more families sent me similar reports. All teenagers, all flagged non-compliant, all denied access without appeal. Maris hadn't backed down. She'd doubled the reach. I watched from my upstairs office as 2 maintenance workers installed a scan pole outside the pool entrance. It wasn't just facial recognition now. It was full-body telemetry, shoulder width, gait, clothing color. A rotating blue light tracked every movement. No one under 18 went near it. Isolde didn't speak much that day. She stayed in her room, door cracked just enough for me to hear her music. Soft, slow, cello-heavy. She hadn't gone back to tennis, or the library, or the cafe she loved across from the gym. Not because she was banned, because she was done being scanned like inventory. At dusk, I walked down to the pavilion again. The laminated signs were still up, but someone had written across one in black marker, Am I a threat if I don't lift my shirt? It stopped me cold. Whoever wrote it had more courage than most adults on this street. As I stared at the words, a voice behind me spoke, You're wasting your time, you know? I turned. Jared Brown, HOA president, stood with his arms folded, no clipboard, just that smug indifference he wore like armor. "She has the votes," he said. "Always has." "You mean she has your silence?" "I mean she has results. Crimes down, vandalism's down, parcel theft, gone. These systems work." "At what cost?" He shrugged. "It's not forever, just until the pilot completes." "You know she forged the vendor approval. That's your theory." "No," I said. "That's a documented pattern of digital misrepresentation, time-stamped, archived, and now mirrored off-site." He blinked. "You mirrored her devices?" "No," I said. "She mirrored mine. Her vendor's firmware pings every node on the residential mesh. She forgot to whitelist which homes weren't broadcasting to private servers." For the first time, Jared looked unsure. "Let me ask you something," I said. "What happens when the vendor gets audited and your name is on the budget approval for a program tied to DHS funding? When the metadata shows minors were flagged without consent? When the contract language she backdated is cross-checked against last year's landscaping vote and falls apart?" He said nothing. "She's not going to take the fall alone," I continued. "She'll take down everyone who nodded and looked away." He opened his mouth, then stopped. Finally, he said, "You're bluffing." "Maybe, but the Office of Civil Rights doesn't bluff, and neither do federal privacy auditors when they find juvenile biometric data in an unprotected scan log." I didn't wait for him to answer. That night, I sent an encrypted packet to a former colleague at DHS, someone I hadn't spoken to since retirement. Attached was a preliminary memo, metadata logs, firmware routing snapshots, Elias's screenshots, and a screen recording of Maris's policies being posted live without board ratification. I didn't ask for a favor. I submitted a complaint. 2 hours later, my colleague replied, "SecOps 7 is under internal review, flagging this for immediate escalation." By morning, the mailbox pavilion looked unchanged, but the signal had already left the neighborhood, and this time, it wasn't coming back unnoticed. The packet I sent was clean, verified logs, metadata hashes, matched timestamps, and no commentary, just like I was trained to submit during internal DHS audits. Let the data speak first. Let the story prove itself. I didn't expect a reply so soon, but the morning after I submitted it, I received a 2-line email from a restricted domain. Acknowledged, monitoring in progress, maintain isolation. It was signed only with initials I recognized from my years in field escalation. That meant 2 things. They'd seen enough to take it seriously, and they didn't want me tipping the board. The next 24 hours, I kept quiet. No meetings, no gym, no back and forth with Jared. I stayed out of sight and let the storm build on its own. In the meantime, I monitored outbound signal spikes from the vendor's hardware. They were growing, more scans, more pings, tighter intervals. Then, right before midnight, something changed. The firmware attempted a silent patch to devices installed at units 14A, 32C, and 40B. I recognized the addresses. All belonged to families that had filed informal complaints in the past month. They were targeting dissenters with new code. The update failed on 32C's camera. It kicked back a log error. The reason? That home used a third-party router with a firmware firewall I'd personally helped install 6 months ago. I called Dean, the homeowner, a semi-retired electrical engineer with more curiosity than caution. "Check your logs," I told him. "Anything weird show up?" After a pause, he said, "Actually, yeah. Something tried to override my root password last night." I asked him to send me a copy. When I opened it, I saw the patch ID, SCOP 7 BT node or VSOR Bihush 3 Wadi. Not only were they still testing, they were actively modifying home networks to bypass consent barriers. I ran the ID through every public repository I had access to. Nothing showed. It wasn't in open source scan libraries. It wasn't listed in the vendor's site, but I still had access to a dormant server in DC, one that hadn't been shut down after I retired. I never used it, until now. I ran the patch ID against the old DHS beta pipeline, and there it was. SCOP 7 BT node push 3.1. Description: behavioral telemetry protocol designed to auto-sequence compliance response latency. Target: residential trial zones. Phase 1 only. Status: restricted. unauthorized distribution under review. I didn't need to guess what that meant. They weren't just watching residents. They were measuring how fast people responded to orders, how quickly they complied, how resistant they appeared, how easily their behavioral patterns could be nudged. Isolde's non-compliance hadn't been a random enforcement. It was data collection. I stared at the blinking console. I wasn't angry anymore. I was cold, detached. This wasn't an HOA overstepping. This was the wrong people using federal money and private software to train a population to submit. Quietly, quickly, without asking. And my daughter had been one of the first variables in their experiment. I exported the data, logged everything, created a forensic hash trail across 3 separate offline drives. The following morning, I walked into the back garden to clear my head. Isolde was sitting there, hoodie pulled up, staring out at the mist rolling down from the ridgeline. She didn't say anything, just nodded when she saw me. I sat next to her, said nothing for a while. Finally, she spoke. She told me I'd look guilty if I didn't lift it, she said, eyes fixed ahead. Like I was hiding something. You weren't, I said. I know, but I still almost did it. Her voice was steady, not angry, not sad, just honest. I reached over and squeezed her shoulder. She picked the wrong family, I said quietly, and now she's going to find out what that costs. I didn't tell her everything yet, not the federal patch logs, not the silent surveillance, not the trial program or the audit spinning up in a server thousands of miles away. But I would, just not before I finished setting the trap. By the time the weekend hit, the air in High Brae Summit felt wrong. Not tense, not chaotic, just staged. Security drones flew lower, slower. More gates had double beep delays before opening, and every child I saw walking alone looked over their shoulder like they were already trained to. On Sunday morning, the pavilion signs changed again, no longer just about badge display. Now they warned of behavioral audits pending. That wasn't HOA language, that was federal contractor language. And someone inside this board, someone with a signature stamp, had approved new language deployment before the DHS review was even complete. I waited until sunset to begin the second phase. It wasn't about gathering more evidence. I had that. This was about leverage. I pulled the screenshots from Elias's drive back up. The Slack message, the vote calendar, the metadata packets Maris's firmware had been pushing to SentryGate Dynamics every 42 minutes. Then I logged into the backup account I hadn't touched since my final year on contract. It didn't access any active DHS systems, but it granted me a pass-through to the Federal Infrastructure Irregularities Tracker, FIIT, a quiet database used by auditors to flag systems that showed signs of national overreach, vendor fraud, or embedded surveillance risks, the sort of database that never showed up in press briefings. I flagged High Brae Summit's scan pattern as a Category 2 irregularity, enough to escalate without triggering a public record, enough to warrant internal movement without tipping off the vendor. Then I triggered the silent protocol that would let my packet bypass the standard 3-week intake delay. 38 minutes later, I received a call from a number that hadn't pinged my phone in 6 years. Still working with a ghost VPN, Win? I smiled faintly. Figured it was time. The voice on the other end belonged to Kira Vall, the former lead architect of SCOP's first oversight branch. She wasn't DHS anymore, technically. Now she ran a civilian partnership arm that audited pilot programs before they hit Phase 2. And I just handed her a bomb. She listened while I laid it out. Every log, every bypass, every teenager flagged as non-compliant. The behavioral telemetry patch. The firmware push. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you have confirmation the miner's data included time-coded biometric samples?" "Yes, 3 sets. Shoulder width calibration, eye tracking, and thermal latency." "That's enough," she said. "I'm notifying civil compliance now." "Do I stay quiet?" "No. Start baiting." "Baiting?" "Don't push for a public fight," she said. "Force her to react, trigger a response. We want to catch her mid-violation when the sweep hits." I knew what that meant. We weren't building a case anymore. We were setting the tripwire. That night, I posted a short message to the High Brae resident forum. Is anyone else being asked to comply with rules that never passed a vote? It was subtle, harmless on the surface. But it had teeth. By morning, 10 replies were live. then 20. Then a private message from someone I didn't expect. Lisette Grainer, the new treasurer. She asked to meet. We met at the outdoor fire circle on Lot 5, an open area away from HOA surveillance zones. When I arrived, she looked exhausted. I joined the board because I thought it would be boring, she said without preamble. Budgets, landscaping, water bills, not this. Then leave. She shook her head. I can't. If I resign now, she'll fold the finance seat into compliance and push through the next phase without oversight. What's the next phase? Uniform badges, not just for teens, for everyone. And when was that voted? She looked at me. It wasn't. I nodded. Then help me finish this. She hesitated. Are you going to leak it? No, I said. I'm going to make sure the people who built it take it away from her. I walked back home as the wind picked up through the canyon. Behind me, the fire circle lights dimmed. In front of me, the pavilion's blue scan beacon flickered. The system was watching. But this time, someone else was watching it back. Elias didn't meet me at his house. He chose a trailhead near the East Ridge, technically outside HOA surveillance range, though I still looped us through a blind spot and kept my phone in a Faraday sleeve. When I got there, he was already pacing, jacket zipped to the throat, hands shoved deep in his pockets. I can't sleep, he said. It's like the air's poisoned. You feel watched? I feel complicit. He reached into his coat and handed me a thin manila folder. Physical. No digital trail. After our last meeting, I started screen capping every admin panel she accessed without full board login. She used a master override 6 times in 2 weeks. Here, this one's the badge program timeline. She uploaded it to the vendor portal before she ever mentioned it at the quarterly. I flipped through it. Dates, vendor contact logs, a redacted correspondence string between Maris and a SentryGate systems liaison. Then, on page 3, something I hadn't seen before, a Phase 2 deployment plan. Wristbands, I said aloud. For children under 14, real-time tracking, Elias replied. Geofencing, emotion-sensing wristbands. She framed it as child protection in her vendor notes. Said if a child left a perimeter without escort, the system would auto-alert a compliance officer. Which officer? She never listed one. I felt the heat crawl up the back of my neck. She's building a predictive compliance grid, I muttered. Train behavior patterns, punish deviation, flag outliers, a suburban experiment using minor data without informed consent. Elias rubbed his eyes. This isn't what I signed up for, Calder. I just wanted to keep the grass green and the budget balanced. Then you need to do one last thing. He looked at me, wary. I need you to forward that folder, scanned, time-stamped, to a specific email address. It's a compliance intake node, encrypted and monitored under review protocol. They won't contact you unless they need to verify. And if they do, they'll already have immunity queued. His face paled. This is real federal? Yes, and it's not optional anymore. He nodded slowly. I'll send it before the board meeting tonight. I didn't thank him. There wasn't time for that anymore. Later that day, I sat at my desk and watched the pavilion through a live camera feed. The new scan node was active again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before, a second broadcast frequency embedded into the firmware. I decrypted it, expecting telemetry or basic diagnostics. But what I found was a heat map overlay of pedestrian traffic, color-coded, adults in green, children in yellow, non-compliant entities in red. The feed pulsed. Red dots appeared near the school bus. Drop-off point. They weren't tracking access. They were logging patterns, times, routes, deviations. Anything that fell outside normal flagged in crimson and logged to a cloud directory in Arlington. Every move, every pause, every glance over the shoulder, quantified and measured. I captured the stream, built a second packet, and labeled it with the protocol tag, SCOP-7, Unauthorized Minor Behavioral Tracking, Non-Sanctioned Pattern Learning. Then I signed it. Win, C, DHS RET, Federal Auditor ID, FAR281, C, inactive. It was the only time I'd used that ID since retirement. I sent the file. This time, I got no reply, but I didn't need one. An hour later, the HOA board meeting started in the community clubhouse. Maris stood at the head of the room in a slate gray blazer, flanked by Jared and Lisette. The room was packed, residents shoulder to shoulder, some whispering, some silent. I stayed outside, watching through the glass wall. Maris opened with a calm smile. As of this week, she said, the pilot has entered its final phase. Beginning Monday, all residents must wear their issued compliance badges during community activity hours. Wristbands for minors will be distributed through the mail. Refusal to participate will result in a 48-hour lockout and possible referral to private security. Murmurs rose, some loud, some stunned. Jared looked uncomfortable, but didn't speak. That was when Lisette stood up and did something I didn't expect. She took out her own badge, unhooked it from her jacket, and placed it on the podium. I no longer consent to this enforcement policy, she said, voice steady. And as treasurer, I am suspending further vendor payments until we can verify the program's legality. Maris went pale. Elias, 2 rows back, stood without a word, pulled his badge too, set it beside Lisette's. Others followed, one by one, and the pile grew. I didn't step into the clubhouse that night. I didn't need to. The moment Lisette dropped her badge on the podium, the data was already moving. While the board argued over what was happening, I was 300 yards away inside my garage-turned-lab, surrounded by a half-dozen screens all pulsing with telemetry feedback from the pavilion node. The live feed showed the badge scans slowing, red markers blinking in and out, hesitant residents, unsure if they should comply with a rule that might no longer be enforceable. The system was beginning to collapse under its own contradictions. I routed into the vendor's back-end API, still wide open, still unencrypted between phases. Their mistake wasn't just greed, it was laziness, and I exploited every inch of it. First, I pulled every scan audit log from the past 30 days. The metadata alone spanned 3 gigabytes. Timestamps, frame captures, failed face matches, temperature deltas, even estimated emotional states based on facial compression. Then I matched the logs to resident data, not names, just ID hashes. From there, I sorted the flagged non-compliant scans by age bracket. 87% of red tags were assigned to residents under 18, minors, and it wasn't random. The scan threshold was more aggressive during after-school hours. The system's behavior shifted with patterns, with anticipation. It learned. Maris hadn't just abused the policy. She'd fine-tuned the algorithm to target teenage movement under the guise of neighborhood safety. And now, that system was sitting quietly in the center of a suburban street, logging every child who passed without knowing they were part of an unauthorized federal test bed. I bundled everything, logs, graphs, audit trails, vendor pings, and wrote a final compliance report. Not a complaint, not a whistleblower letter, a full federal-grade audit summary with structured findings and breach classifications. I used DHS formatting, asset numbers, protocol references. When I hit send, I encrypted the file 3 times and signed it with a one-time private key burned into an old portable drive. The submission bounced through 6 redirect nodes and landed at the compliance address Kira had given me. Then I sat back and waited. 10 minutes later, my system pinged. Incoming request. Source. DHS oversight. Node. 3C. Status. Confirmed packet receipt. They were in. I turned off every light in the garage and locked the door. At 3:11 a.m., I received a second alert. This one silent, almost buried in my routing logs. It wasn't from Kira, it was from a ghost server with no domain signature, just an internal code. SCA-P review nightfall. Action flagged. They weren't just reviewing the data, they were preparing a sweep. The next morning, the pavilion was quiet. The scan node's light was off for the first time in weeks. Residents passed without slowing. A few even glanced up, confused by the silence. No beep, no light. Maris didn't issue a notice. She couldn't. At 9:43 a.m., a white van with no markings pulled through the front gate. The gate didn't open automatically. Someone buzzed them in. I watched from my upstairs window as 3 people stepped out. Black tactical polos, civilian DHS badges clipped to belts, and one gray case that I recognized immediately. It contained a mobile forensics suite. They were going straight to the clubhouse. By noon, every scan node was offline. The HOA site returned a 503 error, and by mid-afternoon, the vendor portal redirected to a blank page with a single line of text. This system is temporarily suspended pending federal compliance review. Maris was nowhere to be seen. Jared tried to hold a neighborhood update outside the clubhouse, but no one showed. Elias stayed inside, packing documents into banker boxes. I saw him carry 3 to the DHS van, each one labeled, each one tagged. I didn't interfere, I let it run its course. When the sun began to set, I walked back down to the pavilion. The signs had been stripped, the scan beacon dismantled. Only the frame remained, like an empty scaffold above the sidewalk. Isolde met me halfway. She stood beside me, looking up at the beam where her name had once been flagged. "They're gone," she said. "For now," I replied. She reached into her hoodie and pulled out a Sharpie. Then, in clean black ink, she wrote one line across the bottom beam. "This neighborhood doesn't scan kids. It protects them." I didn't correct her grammar. I just stood beside her and let the silence settle. The silence didn't last long. By sunrise, the HOA board group chat, technically open to residents for transparency, was in meltdown. Someone had leaked footage of the DHS agents removing the scan node servers from the clubhouse. The video was grainy, night vision enhanced, but the silhouette of the van was unmistakable. The timestamp placed it just past 4 a.m. Half the comments were from residents demanding answers. The other half were from people who still believed this was an overreaction to a harmless safety protocol. I didn't engage either way. Instead, I logged into the vendor portal, what was left of it. Most access points had gone dark, scrubbed clean behind a standard compliance review message. But one node remained active, the admin shell for Highbray's original camera firmware testing sandbox. Buried there was a mirror of the last 24 hours of telemetry logs, data the federal agents had likely already collected, but now I could match it against my own packet. I downloaded everything and archived it twice, once to a drive, once to a cold storage. Box I'd built years ago for exactly this kind of operation, the kind that needed to disappear until the right moment. Then I printed one copy, just one, and took it to the place where the last loose end still sat, waiting for the world to pretend none of this had happened. Maris Thorne's house was 2 streets away from mine, modern, angular, all glass and wood trim, perched like a bird watching over the ridge. She hadn't shown her face since the federal van arrived. Her porch light stayed on. Her car hadn't moved. I walked up the steps and rang the bell. It took her 30 seconds to open the door. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes said enough, pale, rimmed with whatever passed for fear in someone like her. Still in control, but fraying at the edges. I handed her the envelope. "What's this?" she asked, voice brittle. "The last 30 days of behavioral telemetry," I said. Unfiltered, tagged, cross-referenced with vendor code and child data hashes. I kept the names out of it. I didn't need them. She looked down at the envelope like it might explode. "I assume they've already shown you the Phase 2 proposal you submitted without vote?" Her fingers twitched slightly. "I matched the timestamp on the scan node update to your board calendar. You backdated it by 12 days. Elias had the screenshots. I had the data." She stepped back slightly into the doorway's shadow. "They were going to vote on Phase 2 next quarter," she said. "I was just accelerating the timeline. You used children to train an algorithm that penalized delay response," I said. "You designed a system that punished a pause, a hesitation, a flinch, and when that wasn't enough, you installed behavioral learning patches on private hardware you had no right to access." "You don't understand what's coming," she whispered. "Then explain it." She didn't, because there was nothing left to explain. I stepped back down the stairs. "You'll be contacted," I said. "Not by me, but soon." She didn't close the door right away, just stood there, half in shadow, half in morning light. Behind her, a screen flickered to black. One of the internal vendor dashboards, still logged in, still listening. I walked away without looking back. That afternoon, the HOA board issued an emergency announcement. Maris had stepped down from her position to focus on personal matters. Lisette was named acting vice president. Elias was confirmed as chair of the compliance review panel. And the pavilion, it stayed empty. No new signs, no scanners, no new firmware. Just a beam, now bearing Isolde's message, still scrawled in permanent ink. That night, for the first time in weeks, the street felt like a neighborhood again. Not a system, not a lab, just people, living, without being measured. It rained the next morning, light, steady, the kind that blurred reflections in every puddle. The water pooled around the pavilion post where Isolde's message still clung in streaky ink, bleeding just enough to prove it hadn't been removed. I watched from the living room window, coffee in hand, as 2 DHS sedans pulled up to the clubhouse. No vans this time, no gear. Just a team in plain clothes stepping out like they belonged. Because by now they did. One of them, a woman in her 40s with her hair pulled into a tight bun, scanned the lot before entering. She had the gait of someone who'd read the report before the coffee had brewed. I didn't know her name, but I knew the protocol. She was here for the wrap-up. The sweep was done, the equipment confiscated, the scans logged and matched. What came next wasn't surveillance, it was exposure. I spent most of the morning building a localized copy of everything I'd archived, a version stripped of ID hashes, zeroed for public consumption. Not everyone in Highbrace Summit would understand legal breach language or telemetry logic, but they didn't need to. They needed to see the part that couldn't be denied. The part where every scan node defaulted to heightened threat probability when it encountered minors wearing hoodies. The part where pause before compliance was weighted higher than verbal refusal. The part where a teen girl's stillness was flagged more aggressively than an adult man's profanity. I didn't clean it up. I let it burn. At noon, a board meeting was announced. Public, outdoors, mandatory for all residents. I arrived late on purpose. By the time I stepped onto the clubhouse lawn, the crowd had already gathered, folding chairs lined in neat rows, people standing behind fences, umbrellas clutched against the drizzle. Jared was nowhere to be seen. At the front, Lisette stood with a portable mic, paper shaking slightly in her hands. Elias flanked her, face drawn but calm. The Department of Homeland Security has concluded its on-site investigation, she said. The behavioral telemetry pilot has been officially suspended, and Highbrace Summit is no longer listed as a participant in SCOP testing. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Furthermore, she continued, it has been confirmed that the implementation of badge protocols, compliance scanners, and behavioral classification systems were never lawfully approved by a quorum of this board. Vendor agreements were falsified, signatures were repurposed, decisions were made under the pretense of legal authority that did not exist. She swallowed hard. We allowed it, some of us out of fear, some of us out of convenience, and others, myself included, out of inexperience. Behind her, a new sign had been propped against the clubhouse door. Transparency isn't optional, it's policy now. Lisette stepped back and handed the mic to Elias. He didn't use a speech, just looked up, nodded once, and said, "There will be a vote." A woman near the front, Geneva from 35B, spoke up. "On what?" Elias turned to her. "On how much power the board should have. On what security means. On who gets to decide when safety becomes surveillance." The crowd didn't cheer. It didn't clap. But it listened. And in neighborhoods like ours, that was enough. As the meeting broke, I stayed near the back, watching people disperse in small, quiet knots. They spoke in low tones, eyes darting toward the now empty pavilion. A few kids kicked soccer balls on the damp grass. No one stopped them. No one asked for a badge. Maris never appeared. Her house remained dark, blinds drawn, the mailbox slot sealed with tape. By the time I walked home, the sun was beginning to break through the cloud line, casting fractured gold across the ridge. I passed Isolde on the front step. She was sketching again, curled in the oversized hoodie she hadn't taken off in days. Without looking up, she asked, "Is it over?" "No," I said, "but it's finally ours again." She didn't reply, just reached into her sketch pad and handed me a page. A drawing of the pavilion, the beams still bare, the sign still bleeding, but the structure clean, open, untouched by wires or code. At the top, she'd written a single word in the block letters, belonging. The final confrontation didn't happen behind closed doors. It happened on the front lawn of Maris Thorne's house, beneath a sky too bright for the weight of what was coming. By the time I arrived, there were already a dozen neighbors clustered near the curb. Geneva, Elias, even Jared, standing stiff with his hands in his pockets, staring at the pavement like he might fall through it if he blinked. The rest of the board stood farther back, near a city-marked utility van with a compliance seal on the side. The DHS team wasn't in suits this time. They wore jackets with subdued emblems, folders tucked beneath their arms, and a presence that didn't need introduction. They weren't here for another report. They were here for closure. A female agent stepped up onto Maris's porch and knocked. The sound echoed across the cul-de-sac. No answer. She waited, then knocked again, this time harder. The door opened slowly. Maris stood in a slate-gray blouse, hair down, no makeup. Her eyes darted past the agent, scanning the crowd. When she saw me, her expression didn't change. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. The agent held up a folder. Maris Thorne, this is a formal notification. You're being served under Federal Administrative Statute 68-3.1b in relation to unauthorized biometric data collection, behavioral telemetry testing on protected classes, and fraudulent procurement of federal pilot program funding. No one breathed. Maris's voice came low. I followed the guidelines. You bypassed legal vote requirements. You signed falsified contractor authorizations. You used behavioral classification systems on minors without guardian consent. Maris looked at me again. I was trying to keep the neighborhood safe. I took a step forward. No, I said. You were trying to turn a gated community into a control lab. You weaponized hesitation. You punished autonomy. And you gambled my daughter's dignity to do it. The agent continued reading. You are not under arrest at this time. You are under federal administrative sanction and barred from holding elected or appointed positions in any residential, civic, or federally subsidized organization, pending final review. Maris's hands trembled as she took the folder. Behind her, a flicker of movement. Her screen was still on. One of the vendor dashboards visible, minimized but active. I pointed. Is that still live? The agent glanced past her shoulder. We'll take it from here. Maris tried to speak, but the words collapsed in her throat. She stepped back, silent, as the agents entered. The door closed behind them. No sirens, no cameras. Just the sound of an old system exhaling its last breath. Elias walked to where I stood. She's going to try to spin it. I know. He nodded slowly. But this time, she won't get to write the story. A ripple of movement passed through the crowd as people began walking home. Some talked quietly. Others just kept their heads down. There was no celebration, no fists raised, just the tired quiet that comes after a battle no one wanted to fight, but no one could afford to lose. Lisette approached me near the sidewalk. She held a stack of forms, HOA reform petitions, policy rewrites, transparency clauses, things we should have had years ago. She handed me the top sheet. I want you to co-sign the Transparency Review Council. I'm not running for anything. I'm not asking you to, she said. I'm asking you to help write the protections before someone else decides what safety means again. I looked down at the form. Simple language, clean lines, the kind of paper that couldn't hurt anyone if it stayed what it claimed to be. I'll sign it, I said, but only if the first rule we write down is that surveillance doesn't equal security. Deal. She turned and walked back to the group. I stood there a while longer, watching the house that once radiated quiet power now sit still behind its curtains. No lights turned on, no motion at the windows. The structure would stay, but the threat was dismantled. Later that evening, Isolde and I walked past the pavilion again. Someone had repainted the beam. Her handwriting had been preserved beneath a clear sealant. The message was still there, bold now beneath the fresh finish. This neighborhood doesn't scan kids. It protects them. The new signs went up quietly. Not laminated, not threatening. No colored silhouettes or capital letter warnings. Just a single plaque on the pavilion post, screwed in with stainless bolts, centered beneath the cedar beam. Community Standard Devarge 1. No surveillance of minors. Ever. Beneath it, in smaller text, unanimously ratified by resident vote. Enforcement by federal consent decree. It was the first time I'd seen that phrase, by resident vote, mean something here. We didn't just remove a board member, we rewrote the rules. The federal review wrapped 2 weeks later. I was never called to testify. My name stayed off the official summary, but the letter arrived anyway. Embossed seal, acknowledgement of my contributions, and a formal note of thanks for providing the audit integrity necessary to trigger oversight action. I didn't frame it. I didn't post it. I shredded it the same afternoon. This wasn't about being right. It was about putting an end to what never should have begun. Maris moved out before the ink dried on the board's transition vote. Her house sold off-market to a family with 2 toddlers and a fence lined with wind chimes. No one talks about her anymore, not because she's forgotten, because remembering her means remembering how close we came. The scanner nodes were never reinstalled. The badge system was struck from the bylaws. And the behavioral telemetry contract blacklisted, not just from Highbrace Summit, from every residential community that falls under DHS-linked compliance review. Isolde went back to tennis, not right away, but eventually. The hoodie stayed, though, part armor, part memory. She doesn't flinch anymore when we pass the pavilion. She reads the plaque sometimes, never says a word, but I can tell. She knows she was the line, and she held it. Geneva now runs the Resident Oversight Committee. Elias sends out monthly transparency reports. Lisette installed a community bulletin board near the mailboxes. A real one, with cork and pushpins and kid-drawn flyers about lemonade stands and missing cats. I pass it on my walks. Sometimes I stop, just to look. Not to check for threats, just to remember what it feels like when a place returns to being home. Because this wasn't just about policy. It was about trust, about what happens when good people stay quiet, when tech becomes law before it becomes truth, when safety becomes a slogan instead of a promise. I don't expect to be thanked. I don't want to be remembered. But if you're reading this, and you've felt that same cold in your neighborhood, that same quiet pressure behind the rules, the letters, the eyes, then I want you to know something. You're not imagining it, and you're not alone. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. Because sometimes the most dangerous threat in a gated community is the person who holds the gate.